So I thought, John, first of all, thank you, John, for taking the time out to have this conversation with me. Um, I know you've had a very busy semester and even a very busy day. So I'm grateful for your presence and look forward to talking with you. Yonder takes place in 1852 among a group of enslaved people, and it has multiple narrators. And part of the complication with the multiple narrators is it's kind of difficult to read from the book without spoiling things. So I've chosen three really short passages that I hope can give some insight into what's going on in the book without giving away too much. But the first two of the sections that I'm going to read from are narrated by one of the characters named Cato. And one of the things that he is describing is what I call a whispering ceremony, which is part of the spiritual practice of these people, and hopefully will be somewhat self-explanatory. Beneath the light of a few flickering pine knots, Sarah dipped the baby into a pan of water. Even in the dimness, I could detect signs of only one parent in the girl's countenance. The twinkle in her eyes came from Sarah, as did her mouth framed by dimples. Knowing little of Sarah's tendencies, I couldn't speculate regarding the effect they would have on the infant, but I knew enough of Milton's to wonder which of his qualities the baby would inherit. He was trained as a bricklayer, but his real talent was making pictures. Those of us who'd seen his creations could proclaim with confidence that the ancestors guided his right hand. With just a pointed stick and a patch of dust, Milton stirred marvels to life. He drew stars whirling in the night's infinite blackness, great cities of his imagination, signs and wonders he'd seen in dreams. He drew faces too. We could describe a stolen long lost to this life, and he'd make her rise from the ground, seemingly as real as if she were drawing breath. In the days leading up to the birth, he drew his daughter's face again and again. Her arrival only proved the strength of his abilities. Every detail had been exact, right down to the small mole on her downy cheek. Milton's pictures were one of our cherished secrets, fussed over and fondly remembered after the wind and rain had washed them away. The world beyond us knew nothing of his gift. The baby, bathed and rubbed down with warm oil, was wrapped in swaddling clothes. Preacher Ransom held her and spoke in tongues, mumbling ancient phrases while we hummed softly. Once finished, he passed the baby to Sarah. She gathered her in her arms. Moving in a circle, each of us paused when we reached the quietly squirming infant. One by one, we whispered. A baby fortunate to survive long enough to acquire the gift of speech learned quickly about the world into which she was born. There was the likelihood she would never have a chance to use such words as mother or father. Instead, she would learn terms like stolen and thief right after she learned her own name. But no matter the circumstances, she would always find sustenance in the 7 words whispered in her ear. They were our constant companions through every tribulation and every brief moment of transcendence. They reminded us to breathe in the morning and be grateful for air. So I'll read one more section narrated by Cato before moving on. This is a section in which Cato is attempting to survive an ordeal. He has been punished by the owner of the plantation. Rain had been falling for hours. Perhaps fall is too gentle a word. It was the kind of downpour that leaves scars, grooves, and dents in the earth. I shivered in my chains, blinking rapidly as it came down in sheets and pellets. With silent Mary's broth coursing through my innards, I had regained sufficient strength to hold myself in a sitting position, resting my head against the post. I had only to be alive until daybreak, and Green would remove my chains, leaving me bound to him nonetheless. Soaked to the bone, I awaited the dawn while considering the looming paradox of my situation, what little I had to live for. In the distance, the splintered gray boards of our cabins appeared to tremble and dissolve in the wet. The resulting cloud of grayness, murky and unsettled, gradually took on new shapes, outlines of boys and girls. Struck dumb, I watched while they marched down the corridor of the quarters toward me before veering sharply and proceeding toward the plantation borders. clad in garments I had never seen, nothing like our sackcloth and threadbare cast-offs. They passed me in shades of gray, nearly close enough to touch. I had thought of my ancestors as ancient, with a history of torment etched on their weathered faces. But these were children, ranging in age from 5 harvests to 15, with gleaming faces and vigorous frames. I didn't understand their youthfulness. I understood only that they had been in the world before I came to it, and that they now belonged to some other place. Occasionally, a boy or girl would pause and look at me, then rejoin the procession without missing a step. They walked unsullied through the mud, as smoothly as if they were gliding on cushions of air. I called to them, but any sound I made was lost in the fury of the gale. And I read one last section. This is about a woman named Sarah, who is on her way back to where she is confined, and she's being escorted. That's a gentle word. She's being taken, actually, by the overseer, whose name is Holtzclaw, and has less than honorable intentions. Let's see. One second here. Okay. Having helped himself to Silent Mary's baked goods without offering Sarah so much as a nibble, Holtzclaw deduced that he had been perhaps too hasty in his consumption. Midpoint between Placid Hall and Two Forks, his stomach had grown angry and demanded relief. He halted the wagon at the side of a tree-lined road, climbed down, and hurried into a thicket of vines. Sarah could see the top of his head as he squatted and grunted. She could also see a rock, substantial yet handy, on the ground between him and the wagon. She studied it, imagining what she could do with it and calculating the speed and stealth she'd need to cover the distance. Slowly, quietly, she swung her legs over the side of the wagon. Before she could lower her feet to the ground, a flicker of motion in the trees above her head made her pause. She looked up and saw, crouching on a branch, a creature from another world. It rested on one haunch, the other leg fully extended along the length of the branch, with both arms stretched upward and grasping an overhead limb. The being's clothes were made to resemble bark, enabling it to blend almost seamlessly against its background. Most striking was its face, in broad strokes of brown and green, painted so closely together that no flesh showed. Was it a haint? An angel? Sarah was too awestruck to hazard a guess. Without losing balance, the creature folded an elegant arm and placed a finger to its lips. Sarah nearly gasped when the creature leaped and landed gracefully on silent feet. It squatted and, securing Sarah's attention, drew in the dirt with its index finger. After making sure Sarah saw the marks it made, it rubbed them away. Quick as death, it scampered up a tree and returned to its perch. His bowels settled, Holtzclaw came back to the wagon and noticed the glow on Sarah's face. He chuckled to himself, concluding that her radiance was a sign of the excitement he assumed he aroused in stolen winches. Sarah lived to experience even more surprises, but none as wondrous as her encounter with the mystical figure that swooped down from the trees. She knew then that she would always remember the angel's marks in the dirt, even if she never learned to make sense of them. The cryptic letters burned in her memory as if they had been written in flames. In due time, the words read. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was amazing. I wish I said before. I wish you would read more. I mean, and I understand you don't want to give away too much, but yeah, no, it's absolutely wonderful. So first of all, let me just say, your reading was not only wonderful, but this novel is really just, I think, a beautiful, remarkable book. And I urge everyone who's watching to get a copy uh, tonight, if you can. And I'd like to just start with a really basic question, which is, what led you to write Yonder? And in particular, to take up the theme of slavery. Uh, And then, if you can, talk a little bit about. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about, or talk a little bit about, like how you made it your own, right? How you um, developed this story, because it's a really compelling story.
A lot of different things contributed to it, I think. But one of the things when we're talking about writing about slavery, a prominent African American novelist published an essay more than 10 years ago now,
Mhm.
saying, I hope that younger African American writers who are coming after me don't write novels about slavery, because
Right.
that story has been told. So, I read that and I thought, oh man, now I have to write a novel about slavery. As soon as you told me I shouldn't do it, it's like, darn,
Exactly.
I have to do it now, right? So,
Right.
so of course I was looking for a way to do it differently, and I was motivated by a couple of stories, one a known story and one an unknown story.
Mhm.
And the known story is the story of William Lee, who was an enslaved man who served alongside George Washington during the Revolutionary War and was in
Mhm.
love with a free Black woman named Margaret Thomas. And Washington had promised that Margaret Thomas could come and live at Mount Vernon with William Lee after the war in reward for his meritorious service. And Washington changed his mind and told William Lee, Margaret won't be coming. She won't be coming to live with you. And so the records at Mount Vernon show that William Lee lived a fairly long life for an enslaved person, and he lived it alone without
Mhm.
his chosen partner. So that always kind of stuck with me. Imagine going through the ordeal of war in addition to the ordeal of captivity, and your motivation for getting you through it is you're going to get to be with this person who wants to be with you, right? and
Mhm.
then and then to be denied that. So I kind of always had that story in the back of my mind. And the other was an unknown story, right? We can trace our family, my family, back to a couple named Sam and Iris Harris, who were born
Mhm.
in captivity, were
Right.
emancipated. They were children during emancipation,
Mhm.
and eventually were able to marry and start the line of descendants that now includes me. And I
Mhm.
was always curious, what about the couples before them, right? What about their parents and their parents' parents, and what were the circumstances of their coming together, and how long were they able to stay together? These sort of questions have haunted me. So I relied on my imagination, inspired by that William and Margaret, to sort of fill in the gaps, kind of imagine a narrative in which my ancestors may have met and thrived and loved.
Okay. Well, leads me to another question, um, that comes directly from what you just said, which is one of the things that really comes to very powerfully in this novel is the role of love, right, in the sustenance of Black life, right? It's not just romantic love, but a kind of deeper, profound love of people who are really kind of surviving, doing everything they can to survive. People like you, and in the face of just really relentless oppression. I mean, one of the things that the book also does so beautifully is it shows, just the kind of multi-layered violences, right, the tribulations that all these characters go through, psychic, physical, social, emotional, etc. So could you talk a little bit about, like, how you conceptualized weaving love through? I mean, because love actually, I mean, when it's the sustenance of Black life, it actually sustains. I don't want to give away the plot, but it sustains several of the main characters here in very, very interesting ways, and how it ties into, I think, another key theme of this book, which is resilience. I mean, you mentioned the scene with Cato, and there's when he has the visitation, which I'll get to in a minute, but he has this visitation from the ancestors, and even before that, the character Isaac. I think Isaac says, I may have this wrong, but I think Isaac says, "Don't quit," right?
Yeah.
Which is so powerful. Right? So it's like there's love, and there's also how it relates to resilience. I was just really interested in how you were working through that.
Yeah, it's a through line, I think, through all of my fiction, right? So
Mhm.
it's a particular concern of mine is love. I'm fascinated with like you say, it's not just romantic love, but I will confess that I am particularly interested in those stories. Like I always read
Mhm.
those columns, where people are getting married, and it talks about how they met and what the so I read all that stuff, right? I love that stuff. So I always want to know the story behind it, right? And
Right, right.
I don't want to be that guy who when I meet a couple go, so tell me, how did you meet? But I'm in the back of my mind, I'm already wondering that. I wonder wonder what circumstances brought them together, right?
Right.
So, so I tend to address that in the work, and so in my first work of fiction, um, near the end of the book, following the assassination of Martin Luther King, the couple at the heart of it, the woman says to her husband, the king of love is dead, but love is here to stay," right? And that's the last line. And then only the strong is the story of three couples and how they interact and succeed and fail on their own terms. So that the longer narrative through the fiction is this narrative around love. And then,
Mhm.
like you say, in Yonder, as in the previous books, I guess I'm really interested in community love, right? To
Mhm.
the where our fondness for each other and our willingness to endure and struggle for each other kind of keeps the community going, kind of keeps it humming, right? And so when William, when he reflects, he says, not only did I find Margaret, but I found Cato as my brother, right? Because
Right.
that relationship is extremely important. And I mean, and he says to Cato, what you might say to a brother, but what you might also say to a lover, which is, I'm willing to give up my life for yours,
Mhm.
essentially,
Right.
right? And so I just wanted to look at the ways that these things kind of resonated in the culture, and then also I'm also thinking of Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that Black people were incapable of genuine romantic attachment. Therefore, it's
Mhm.
okay to break up their families because they don't really love each other like that. All they have is
Right.
animal urges, and heartbreak is soon forgotten among them, right? I mean, and that's his language, not mine. And we know that isn't true, right? It's, it's it's just like one of the worst lies ever perpetuated about us, right? And so I always kind of feel like, hmm, let me show you what Black love looks like. If I have the opportunity, I'm going to do it, right?
Right.
So
Yeah, no, that's. I mean, I think, but your exploration of Black love, well, like so many things in the book, is incredibly powerful. Let's also talk about terminology. I was fascinated by these terms you used. Thieves and thieves, and stolen, right? Which, of course, I mean, it takes a second to orient yourself to them, but once you start to read and get into the book, I mean, it makes total sense. But other things that you have in here, like the rituals of like whispering, a term like patty rollers. I was curious. I mean, how much of this was invention? How much of this was research? And you mentioned, both the known story and then the familial story. But I also felt like, I could feel your imagination just
yeah.
flowering here as you were getting into this world and coming up with all kinds of like fascinating, terms for things and people. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things is you know it's a story that's often told, and even with the story being often told, we know that we've barely scratched the surface of it, right?
Right.
There's just layers and layers of our history in this country that if we all sat down and said we're going to write a book about this subject, we still wouldn't cover but a fraction of it, right?
Right.
But part of my challenge, my creative challenge, I guess, as a creative person, is how can I tell it differently? What can I do
Mhm.
differently in my story? And it's just a few things I was thinking about. I was thinking about code switching and the way
Mhm.
we might talk to you and I might talk to each other if we saw each other, on the street in our hometown that we share,
Right.
or
Right.
how we might talk to each other, on Zoom, right? We're capable of fluency and more than one kind of lingo, and that was so absolutely necessary during this period of enslavement.
Mhm.
It was a matter of life and death. So I wanted to take care to have the language kind of reflect that kind of fluency. So that was important to me. And then also, I wanted to, I'm going to badly paraphrase Du Bois, but I didn't want the characters to be looking at themselves through the eyes of someone who despised them. I wanted them
Mhm.
to look at themselves through the eyes of people who knew and saw and loved them. And so I knew that the language would be different. And I also wanted to, push back against this notion that it was a paternal relationship, that enslavement was paternal, and that, the enslaved were childlike and revered their captors, and I think that's pretty far from the truth. I think they saw their captors as the morally bankrupt hypocrites that they were, right?
Mhm.
And so I wanted the language to reflect that.
Okay. And that way, because one of the questions I was going to ask you was about the theme of code switching and double consciousness, in which you actually in very interesting ways, literalized. I mean, you have several of the characters actually point out, we have, and this is of course true today too. We have to be absolutely aware of every whim, that they've every shift in their, the consciousness of the slave owners of white people. We have to be very conscious of this because our lives depend on it.
Right, right.
And then you have the fascinating shifts. I mean, I'm thinking of the character William, Williams or Cato, their narration to us, which is just so rich and beautiful. And then of course when William is working in that pit and he's talking to his thief owner Green, he basically he goes to what feels like almost kind of stereotypical language, right? Which is the language, it's a language of on one hand, that he knows is not going to offend because he's told, I mean, when he's sort of the special character, basically, your life could end tomorrow too. You're not as valuable as you think you are. But also, it's a language of, interestingly, one of the things I picked up was resistance. So could you talk a little bit about this, a little bit more about code switching, and we could say, multiple consciousnesses that these characters convey and embody, right? I think it's really sort of powerful component of the story.
Yeah, it's interesting, John. The first line of the novel, "All of us have two tongues,"
Mhm.
um, actually came to me many years ago when I was walking down the street in Champaign, Illinois, and I had my little moleskin notebook in my back pocket, and I got it out and I wrote that line down. All of us have two tongues, and I said, "Nah, it's gonna go in something." I
Right.
don't, how that is. I don't know what it is yet, right?
But you have to do that. You have to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't let that get away. So I guess I've thought about that a lot. Just not just
Mhm.
historically, the ways we have to negotiate, navigate these linguistic pathways, and I mean that's my personal experience. That's a lot of our personal experience. I lived on the all black North Side, inner city, St. Louis. But I went to schools for gifted children on the South Side, and which was overwhelmingly white, right? So I had to develop, two sets of vocabularies in order to be able to navigate those two worlds successfully. And at the time, I was even conscious of it then, right? The necessity of doing this. I was aware that I was doing it, right?
Mhm.
So I was thinking about that, and then also in the course of researching an earlier book, I'd read some stuff about elaborate Southern courtesy and how a lot of it was attributed to the South's fascination with Sir Walter Scott novels, that
Mhm.
somehow it had influenced how Southerners interacted with each other. But then an African American scholar, and it pains me that I can't think of where I read this first, but it was an African American scholar who said, well, less than Walter Scott novels, it's actually Black people, because Black people had to develop these elaborate courtesies in which they anticipated
Mhm.
the needs of their oppressors in order
Right.
to stay alive. They had to it's like playing chess. They always had to be a couple
Mhm.
moves ahead. And
Yep.
they had to be that way with the language too, right? So, and occasionally, I mean, there's a place in the novel, a really small part where one of the thieves catches one of the stolen, kind of not code switching immediately. And there's a character named Double Sam, and he
Mhm.
asked Double Sam, and Double Sam says, "I don't suppose."
Mhm.
And the thief says, "What did you just say?" And he says, "Oh, I reckon I reckon it don't make me no never man." So he corrects
Right.
himself really
Right.
quickly, and
Right.
that kind of illustrates this this adroitness that was required all the time.
Right. I mean, well, the other thing too that, I mean, you mentioned Double Sam. I mean, another interesting thing that we see is the sort of facades that people put up. So with Double Sam, he's having this conversation with this twin who has died, and the thieves of white people see him as just this crazy person. But then what we also see, and this is also what I want to think about, is there's this incredible artfulness when it comes to part of it is kind of self-protection, resistance, right? And part of it is just like, I mean, just sort of a way of staying sane by appearing insane, right? But he also has this incredible gift with animals, right? And we show that again and again, how all of these characters, in a sense, possess. well, not all, but many of them, right? The main ones possess a kind of artfulness, right? Whether it's in the way that they interact with each other, in the way, like I think of little Xander and his this desire to fly, and his way that he moves through the world. Is it Silent Mary and her cooking? So, can you talk about that? Because I think this is something uh, it's sort of fundamental to this novel, right? These skills that these characters have, and how in a powerful sense they can see each other, even though the larger society around them cannot see them really at all for who they are.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is kind of addressing this notion of genius, which for for centuries was denied us, right?
Right.
It was seldom used to describe us, even when we're talking about art. Our art, no matter how sophisticated it is usually folk art. Our
Hmm.
philosophy, no matter how sophisticated it is folklore, right? All the time. And so I kind of wanted to push back a little bit through the character of Milton and Double Sam and Silent Mary, this idea of Black genius flourishing everywhere in the most impossible circumstances. And in many instances, the world missing it and missing out on it, failing to recognize it. It's like one of the things, and someone asked me about this, Milton is this character who can, he can draw with a stick in the dirt, like create entire
Yeah.
worlds, right?
Yeah.
And somebody asked me, why wasn't that revealed to the larger world? Because only the Black people in the novel know about this gift. No one else knows about it, right? And so, but I wanted it that way. I thought there was some potency in some of our genius being secret, right? That
Mhm.
that we didn't share it with the larger world, where it would be exploited or brutalized or in some way or appropriated, right? So I think I was looking at the preciousness of Black genius, and just wanted to kind of have the characters kind of circled that idea, and to know that some of them were extraordinarily gifted,
Mhm.
whether others recognized it or not, right? I mean, all of the stolen people noticed that, when Double Sam walked through the hen house, all the hens, dropped eggs, right? And that all of this. So I just wanted those elements in there. I thought it would help create a whole world that these
Mhm.
characters lived in.
No, it felt very believable. It felt very, very believable. And yes, I mean, and also again, this thinking about like love, uh, care, concern, how the members of the stolen community, the Black people, right? They could appreciate, not always, right? Because you give us, and I'll get to this in a minute, but you give us characters who really, who are working with the oppressor, or just sort of in their own on their own plane, but most of the people really could appreciate these gifts. So I thought that was actually beautiful how you wove that in. I want to talk a little bit about, because you opened by talking about the way that you wrote the novel, and so I wanted to just kind of ask you to talk a little bit about this braided narrative, which I thought was incredibly effective. The voices become very clear very quickly, um, and it was actually very easy to follow. But the best thing was there was so much depth in each of these chapters. So as you shifted from voice to voice, there was so much depth in each one. So you were able to do quite a bit. I think in with these sort of concise narrative, um, narrative blocks. So just talk a little bit about the narrative, and what led you to write it in this way. With these multiple voices telling the story.
Yeah, initially, that wasn't my intention. When I first started drafting it, it was strictly William's story. And in the course of events happening to William, I guess the other characters began to say to me, "Well, that's not quite how I experienced the same thing, or
Mhm.
saw it the same way." And at the same time, they're all kind of philosophizing about storytelling, especially William, but not just William, right? I mean, Margaret has her little stretch about, it really depends on who's telling the story. William says to Cato, we can shape this. It's all in the telling, right?
Mhm.
So they are self-conscious narrators. They know I'm relaying a record of events, and I want to be persuasive about it. So in the creative process, what I did was create a dossier or a profile of each of these narrators, right? And so I put a lot of information about each of them in there, and all of that information is not in the book, right? Some of that information is for me, just to help me kind of understand who these characters are, what they're afraid of, what they love most, whether or not they knew their parents. Sometimes that plays out in the narrative, sometimes it doesn't, right? And I thought that would also their contact with literacy, their contact with books would vary, right, and would and be reflected in how they chose to describe things. And I was thinking of, Ralph Ellison had this theory of what he called floating literacy, that there was more literacy among enslaved people than they let on, right? And it just kind of floated through communities and manifested itself in different ways. And I was always kind of intrigued by that. And so there's some of that. I mean, one of the characters, without giving anything away, keeps his literacy so close to his vest that the people closest to him are not aware that he has acquired this talent. So stuff like that.
Right. When you speak, I mean, that of course reminds me of, that links to, I'm not going to give anything away, but the whole rules of civility, I think that was the title, right? How that comes into play. That was fabulous. Another really, I think, a really compelling aspect of this novel was the way that you play with the speculative elements, and you gave us a glimpse of it in that little section about Sarah. And you have a number of, so it's interesting how the speculative and the real kind of intersect, right? You think one thing is happening, and then you come to realize another thing's happening. Again, I'm not going to give anything away, but you mentioned, like the Bubayalis, right? The people who can fly, swing low. There's the apparition of Isaac and the ancestors, and Isaac speaks to Cato when after he's been pickled, and then the ancestors appear. And I was really, really curious about, how you thought about incorporating these speculative elements in, because they feel authentic. They feel grounded in the story itself, and not, just kind of, sort of tacked on. So I was,
Well, I mean, part of it is me. I believe ferociously in my ancestors, right? I believe they are present, right? That's part of my spiritual practice, if you will. And so my narratives reflect that in each of my books. They're actually characters. If you go back and look, you realize that person was an ancestor. That person wasn't necessarily, our generation. So it's really a continuation of something that I've been doing. And so, I don't mean to appear to be coy, but I'm less certain about the spectral elements than readers are. I'm hesitant to say this is spectral and this is realistic, because for me, that barrier between these two realms is quite permeable, right? So these are things that can happen and have happened, I believe. And in at least one instance in the book, I didn't realize a character was an ancestor until it manifested as someone goes to look for him and he's not there, right? It wasn't until that point that I realized, oh. So I had to be open to possibilities too, but yeah, I'm always fascinated by that, particularly in African American communities. And I wanted to kind of I wanted to create these other spiritual practices, right? The way they mourn with the white strips of cloth, the whispering ceremonies, the 7 words they say. I was really, we talk about decolonized imaginations. I wanted to conceive of a decolonized spiritual practice. What would that look like, right? So, and the great thing about fiction is I got to make it up.
Right. Well, and you also, I just want to say that, again, I don't think I'm giving anything away, but you have a character who is, on the one hand, or let's put it this way, this character understands all of this, and on the other hand is skeptical. I thought that was interesting, because it's not, you give us the range, so it's not a kind of unqualified acceptance of everything, but we have someone who actually pressing back and, really, I mean, questioning not just spiritual practice, but really, religion writ large, right? Which I thought was very, very, like a nice passing counterpoint.
Yeah, I figured there would be a character who would say, we're having all these discussions of what this afterlife looks like. And this character says, why is that even desirable? Why is the idea of more life after this being something you want?
Right, right,
especially since you don't know with certainty what it will be like,
right,
right? What if the joke's on us? What if it's just more of this, right? And
right.
so I just thought it was healthy to have these other kinds of characters who say that sounds good, but it's not for me.
Exactly, exactly. I'll ask you one more question, and then I'm gonna open it up because I see we have some questions in the Q and
Okay.
A. I was curious about because you've written about the N word and you weave it in here, and I thought you did a beautiful job with it. But I was interested in the form of it and what led you. Did you think about that when you were writing it, and were you? Because I felt like it was a bit of play with the reader, and but there was also sort of integral to the story you were telling. You talk a
Yeah,
little
I
bit
mean,
about that.
sure, yeah. So the black characters who use the word are shall we say the least virtuous characters in that. And so and Cato does reflect on that. He says we don't even use this, but certain people do, right?
Right.
And then also my spelling of it was very deliberate,
Mhm.
to not use the ER version, because you know when you look at the long use of the word, so often the version that's not ER is equivalent, right?
Right.
And so I wanted to sort of like push back at that distinction we like to make,
Mhm.
and so that was very deliberate. And you're the first person to mention it in conversation, so that's kind of interesting.
Because I was like, he's written about this, so he knows.
Right.
I felt it was a deliberate choice, but
Yeah.
like I said, I think it worked very well. I think it worked very, very
Oh,
well.
good, good, good.
Yeah. Okay, let's see what questions we have in here. Oh, these are great. Okay, so the first question is, if you were to make a reading list to go along with Yonder, what books would be on it?
Wow, that's an excellent question. And it would be really long. And my disclaimer at the beginning is if you ask me the same question tomorrow, I probably have a different answer because I would think of other things that I wish I had said.
Mhm.
But influential to me was A Mercy by Toni Morrison, was one that I paid particular attention to. Um, Dessa Rose by Shirley Ann Williams was really important to me. Um, um, The Known World by Edward P. Jones. I see it in conversation with that, and a number of nonfiction books. All three of Douglas's memoirs. There's a memoir by another person who escaped enslavement named Lewis Clark, which was really influential. The whole character, the idea of the character of